Good afternoon, everybody. The purpose for this recording is to add some voice to the images that you can get on the Echo 360 for the architectural practice lectures held on week 7. For some reason, the sound wasn't recorded on the Echo 360, so this is the purpose of this recording. So what I will do here is essentially use the Echo 360 images and talk to them. So we are talking about consultants for lecture 11, and what we will start is to look at what a consultant is. So essentially, a consultant is someone who gives their information and their advice, their expert information advice to a client. So we are talking in terms of the construction industry. So what we're talking about is people like architects who are consultants who expertly advise their client, who might be the principal, the person who is organizing for the funding of the project and who will need to use the end result for their own purposes, or the builder. And sometimes architects, builders can be clients of architects as well, as we will see in the procurement lecture a bit later on. So essentially, the definition of a consultant is someone that only provides expert advice, and rather than someone that actually builds the building. So you can see consultants as someone being different to a builder. So this lecture will cover three things: the consultants and their relationship to the stages of the architectural project, the types of consultants and their role, and the engagement of consultants. So in this case, what we are basically talking about is architects as being the lead consultant, the primary consultant, as you can see on this slide. So, of course, the primary consultant role could be played by others, but again, we'll look at that in the week 9 lecture on procurement. So, primary consultants are also referred to as a lead consultant. Now, a specialist consultant is one who is a specialist in a particular field, who can contribute to part of the design. Specialist consultants can be divided into two different groups. Secondary consultants, whose work is directly is directed by the lead consultant, generally engaged by the clients, and sub-consultants whose work is also led by the lead consultant, but is actually engaged by the lead consultant themselves. So really the main distinction here is between the primary consultant or lead consultant and the sub-consultants or the specialist consultants. So it just depends on the industry that you're speaking from or speaking within. So architects like to use the term specialist consultants, whereas builders and clients would rather use the term sub-consultants. Okay, now it is interesting to note that sub-consultants in the context of Acumen, which is the practice notes for architects, has a different meaning to how builders use the term sub-consultants, which is how I've just described it. So in general, a specialist or sub-consultant is one that specializes in a particular field, which may contribute to part of the design, but generally not the entire design. So, continuing along, what we will now do is we will look at consultants and which stage of the architectural project that they actually contribute to. As I said before, the reason for consultants is really to provide skills and expertise which the lead consultants don't have, or the lead consultants do not have time to do it, or that the lead consultants do not hold a mandatory registration of certain consultants. So there are many different kinds of consultants, but I will talk about a few in particular that need to be registered in the same way that architects need to be registered. I might point out that these registrations are not always done in the same way as with architects, where they are actually registered by the state. Some consultants are actually privately accredited. So I will pull out 4 different kinds of consultants which need accreditation or registration. The first one is engineers who are accredited by the Institute of Engineers of Australia, and what that requires is that you are required to study within an accredited program and graduate from it, and then you are to have 3 years expertise underneath a registered or accredited engineer. In contrast, building surveyors or building certifiers have the same kind of registrations that architects have. They contrast to engineers in that the registration of building surveyors or certifiers is actually done by bodies that are part of the state and territory governments who administer the acts that cover building certifiers and surveyors. Similarly, energy consultants are registered by the state, by bodies that are set up by the state or territory governments, as well as land surveyors. So each land surveyors, the land surveyors of each state or territory would be governed by the Land Surveying Registration Board of that state or territory. So what we will now go through is the different types of consultants and the way that they relate to the stages of core architectural services. So a recap of the stages of an architectural project according to architects, to the work that architects do. At every one of these stages, we need the advice of consultants. Stage 1 includes land surveyors, urban planners, interior designers, and landscape architects. Stage 2 includes building surveyors, structural and civil engineers, and quantity surveyors to inform the design development. We might go back to stage 1. Of course, during the concept design, what you need to do is the limitations of your land, the limitations of the planning regulations, as well as people to help you with the sketch design of the interiors and the site as well. If we move to stage 3, which is the development application, in complicated cases, you may also need urban planning consultants to help you with your development applications. And at stage 4, when you're talking about construction documentation, you really also need the input of people such as the engineers, and they need to be registered because, of course, their documents will need to be approved by the building surveyor. Now, quantity surveyors are often brought in at this stage to advise on cost, and of course, building certifiers are often brought in at this stage as well, because their input is important to have the building approval process go smoothly. So, in stage 4, what the result of all this work will be actually the building approval to start construction. Now, on top of that, before we can start construction, we of course need to select a contractor. And again, on this note, we need building certifiers to help us to check the certification or the registration of builders. And also quantity surveyors to help us to decipher the tenders that we have received from the contractors. And finally, in stage 6, during the construction or during contract admin, we require the assistance of building certifiers, land surveyors to help with the set out of buildings during construction, and geotechnical engineers to ensure that what we come across inside the earth is actually what we have what we need in the first place. So moving right along. At this stage, what I might also do is go back to the is to go back to the um, so apologies everyone. I've actually gone backwards here to the slide before. So what I wanted to tell you at this stage is that you should go to have a look at the Acumen website, just to see the different kinds of specialist consultants that are listed over there. So apart from the ones that I mentioned before, there are also consultants that deal with lifts, consultants that deal with acoustics, property valuers, interior and furniture designers, landscape architects, specification writers, kitchen and bar consultants, safety consultants, security consultants, heritage consultants, and so on and so forth. So I'll leave you to have a look at that for yourself. But the thing to note is that the difference between a consultant whose skill is needed compared to a consultant whose registration is needed. What I will now say with this slide essentially is that for smaller and more straightforward projects, architects, builders, and subcontractors may perform the roles of some consultants. So, in projects that I have worked on, in some very small projects that I've worked on, some extension projects that were built entirely with lightweight construction, timber construction, my building certifier actually accepted data from the AS 1684 timber framing code. So what I needed to do was essentially to show him that my structural design was actually conform with that Australian standard, and he accepted that my design conformed with the AS 1684. And on the same note, that meant that we then did not need to have a structural engineer involved, and therefore save the client some money. While we're on that note, we might also say that we might also talk about domestic projects, because pretty much in most domestic projects or residential projects, we don't actually have hydraulic engineers who will help us with our plumbing. The plumbing is pretty much designed by the plumber, who of course has to then provide a certificate for the plumbing works to say that it conforms to the standards. So plumbers are also registered people, as are electricians. So again, with residential projects, we may not have electrical engineer necessarily involved, where the electrician will actually provide the work and the certification required for the electricals in the building. So what we will now do is move on to part B, which talks about the different types of consultants and their role within the building project that has architects involved in a little more detail. Each of these consultants produce information to complement the work of the architect, but are coordinated by the architect to ensure a coordinated outcome. So the first one of these is building certifiers. Now, I have previously shown you sample documents of a project that has been certified or that has been given building approval by a building certifier or building surveyor. So I'll leave you to go and have a look at that. And I've also previously talked about what building certifiers do within architectural projects. So what we will now do is to go through a few different documents that I will also load, that have also been loaded up to the Moodle, and you can see with those 4 over there, and then we will have a few more slides to talk about the other ones. So the first set of drawings that we will look at are drawings by structural engineers. So I've actually put this on the Moodle as well. But what you can see here is that you're getting a very specific form of information that is only about the structure. Now, of course, it is coordinated towards the architectural drawings, and architects need to check that. But specifically, it gives things like sizes of bearings and floor joists, sizes of lintels, the form of masonry walls, concrete, and so on and so forth. Essentially, this kind of information is actually included in the architectural drawings, but only as indications of which the actual sizes, the actual types of wood, the actual strength of steel, the actual strength of concrete, and sizes of steel. All of those things are fall into the realm of the engineer, and they are the ones who would actually be specifying all this. So you can see here the member schedule. So every single piece of structure is actually specified by the engineer, because the engineer has to then certify that all of this stuff actually conforms to the Australian standards for these sorts of things, and also to certify that the thing won't fall down. This goes right down to the detail level, as you can see here, where not only do they specify what is used, but they also demonstrate how it is fixed and how it actually goes together. So the next set of drawings that I'll show you is from a licensed surveyor. This actually is important because these become legal documents for the project. So what you can see here is that the surveyor actually determines what the shape of the land is, what the heights and contours and features of the land are, and then from there we can then use that as a legal document, which is why they're licensed. Legal document to be a true representation of the topography of the and the size of the site. And this is important when one is trying to deal with levels, because what actually happens is that we need to provide all this kind of information to the authorities to make sure that they know what we're actually doing, and then can actually see that we are conforming to the regulations. Also with setbacks, this is very important, because it's very important to know exactly where the boundaries are. The other registered type of consultant that we use is energy raters, and then they are the ones who then go through our design and our well specified design, put it through a rating system, and then come up with a star rating for the house, which we will then be able to provide to the building certifier to show that we are conforming with the sustainability requirements of the building rules. So their methodology is all very clear, and their working method is all very clear. So every single element is put through the calculations. We then get a record of the calculation to see how many stars we have. Now, we generally need this kind of advice throughout the process, because we need to know how best to design the house in order to have the required outcome. So it's good to have energy raters involved during the design development phase, so that we can know what kind of windows we need, how much insulation we need. Sometimes building surveyors may also be able to help us with things like how to actually design the house. But on the same note, they can also advise us as to the limitations of the software. So we do know that the first-rate software used in Victoria is something that very much likes more square-like plans. Yeah, they like more. If you have a square plan, it tends to have a better energy rating than a long rectangular plan. So the next set of consultants or the next consultant that we'll look at is the geotechnical consultants. They are really engineers. They are registered like structural engineers, but they're called geotechnical engineers. So what they do is they actually go and test the soil of our site in order to tell us what the strength is and how we should actually treat it in terms of structure. So their information is very important for the structural engineer. as you can see from here, how they do that is they actually go and make a number of boreholes within the site, and then they actually pull out the soil, and by looking and by feeling the soil, they can from a certain depth, they can actually tell what kind of soil it is, and they write us a report based on that. So the next kind of people that we'll be looking at is actually some consultants that came from Tony Trobe's lecture from last year. He had a really interesting project because this was a coastal project with all sorts of different overlays for development approval. So he needed to get a whole stack of different kinds of consultants involved. This included flora and fauna consultants, a mob called Ecological, who actually wrote a report based on what was required by the environmental overlays of the council. Now, so what they had to do was basically to demonstrate that the design would not impact on the flora and fauna or the habitat of certain protected species, and would not be damaged by the proposal. So what we see here is really the areas where they wanted the house to go, and therefore the main sort of study area of their report. And in purple is actually the site of the land. It is actually a spit of land that sticks into the sea, and was very sensitive. And what they did was, in particular, they were looking for the presence of the powerful owl on the subject areas, and they did that by actually looking for hollow-bearing trees where those owls like to nest, and also for owl pellets to look for essentially evidence of owls of powerful owls being in that area. So essentially, once they had that distribution, then they needed to then cross-check that against the proposal. So this proposal was made up of two parts, and essentially what they showed was that the proposal of the two houses was not going to affect the one tree where those powerful owls were actually nesting. Now, another overlay was actually scenic amenity. So the council required a report to be written by a consultant to say that the design would not impact on the scenic amenity of the site. The site, of course, being a coastal location where they actually wanted to preserve how the coast actually looked on there. So this was actually a part of the report which demonstrated that the house was not going to be visible from the key points that the overlays thought were important. The next kind of consultant they used was actually these hydraulic engineers, which basically designed an on-site sewage management system and then reported on how that was actually going to work in terms of the site. So what this means is that the site does not have main sewage, and they needed to then design a system of septic tanks to deal with the sewage of the two houses. And not only that, but they also needed to design overflow systems for that, because that's what happens to septic tanks, is that or sewage treatment plants, is that they have to get rid of their grey water once the sewage has been treated. So what they needed to do was to demonstrate that they could design and build a system whereby that water would be retained and would not make its way into the sea. So they did that by a series of mounds, which would then contain this grey water overflow from the sewage treatment plants. They go right down to the technical detail of how to actually build the mounds from which those grey water would exit and would be distributed and then engaged and then absorbed into the soil. So the third part of this lecture is really about how one engages consultants. And there are two things that are important here, I suppose. One is how lead consultants are engaged and how specialist consultants or secondary and sub-consultants are also engaged. So the main thing to think of here is to think of the chain of command and communications, and we will talk a bit more about this when we get into the procurement aspects of construction, which is one of the lectures coming up, which will be given by Robin Hardy. Now, this is really a recap of how Acumen refers to things. So Acumen refers to specialist consultants, which in the construction world they are referred to as secondary consultants or sub-consultants. So what we need to get into here is to talk about what the process of selecting consultants is. So essentially, as I said before, consultants can be selected by the client or the architect. And in some cases, in all cases, really, if the client wants to choose consultants, this should really be vetted by the architect, or the architect should check to see that the consultants that the clients want to work on the project are actually qualified and able, and so on and so forth. Quite often, clients will want to have their own consultants because of existing friendships, relationships, and that they've used them before, and so on and so forth. There may be a myriad of reasons why a client wants to use a certain sub-consultant. So for the architect, what this means is they may have to work with people that they've not worked with before, so they need to be a little careful in this case. So the appropriate consultant also depends on the type and scale of job. So if a client is building a multi-story building, a 20-story building, and they previously used a structural engineer on their house renovation, then one would need to check to see whether that consultant, that engineer, is able to be doing that kind of work, regardless of whether the client wants them or not. And the architect's role is really to report back to the client as to the appropriateness of any one consultant that doesn't come through the architect. There is risk involved, of course, because even though an architect may only choose people that they have successfully worked with in the past, situations may change, and so the architect has to really make things very clear in terms of their recommendation of consultants in terms of managing risk. Now, for very large jobs, open proposals can be called for. However, the client needs to have the requisite evaluation skills. So what this means is that there's basically a call for expressions of interest, or or they tender the consultant work, and a number of consultants then put in proposals to do the work, but this is not going to. This can only be done if one knows how to read the tenders or the reports that or expressions of interest that hopeful consultants want to put in. The alternatives to this kind of open tender type situation for consultants for for specialist consultants or sub-consultants is to negotiate with one consultant, generally someone that either the client or the architect has worked with before, or to have a limited call for proposals, which is really where you've got a series of consultants which are known to be able to deal with that sort of work, or to have that limited list be pre-vetted by the architect, and also to have those consultants pre-register for projects, so that they can be selected from a list that already knows quite a bit of about them. Now, the engagement of consultants is really about minimizing the architect's exposure, or it's about minimizing risk. So in this case, what architects need to do is the risk comes in terms of payments. So you have the risk of the client not wanting to pay a certain consultant, or you have the risk of a consultant not performing. So what architects will always try to do is to get the client to engage a consultant directly, a consultant that has been already approved by the architect as suitable. So in that case, the relationship between the architect and the consultant is a communications one, and the contractual or financial relationship is between the consultant themselves and the client, not between the consultant and the architect. In some cases, clients ask architects to provide an entire consultant consortium for a project. And in this case, usually what happens is that the architect then goes into contract with the client, and the architect is the one who then is responsible for all the other consultants. So what happens is, if anything, if the consultants don't perform, or there's a problem, then it then becomes the architect's responsibility rather than the client's responsibility, because the architect has actually engaged the consultants. So where you have a situation where the client offers one fee for a whole team of consultants, the advantages of this are that this setup is good for inexperienced clients because there's only one fee to pay. So architects get to lead and the whole process, and problems are resolved without the client, which means that there's one less person to deal with. And then consultants will have confidence in the relationship because it's perfectly professional, rather than having to deal with a client who might not be experienced in these matters. Their roles and responsibilities are very clearly defined, and are based on a relationship with the lead consultant and with no one else, which also simplifies things. This also allows ongoing relationships from previous jobs to continue unfettered, if you like, so that they can actually work together in the way that they used to, and build on each other's systems and so on and so forth. So disadvantages are that the liability is shared then between all the consultants, and the architects become responsible for the consultants' fees. So in this case, professional indemnity and registration and so forth becomes the architect's responsibility, and the administration costs for paying the fees of all the specialists and sub-consultants is borne by the architect, not the client. Okay, so that now brings us to the end of the lecture on consultants.